So I think this actually leads us into an interesting segue of I mentioned the promise of SIM, but when we were talking about this pre-show, you actually said you look at it more of the broken promise of SIM. So could you give the audience a little more color around that? Like what did you mean by that? Because I thought it was super interesting.
The broken promise of SIM is interesting. I think, well, for one, SIM promised to correlate data from different systems, and it promised to understand your data, your environment, your system. And when you look into the reality, very few teams do proper correlation, right? In some ways, it kind of still acts as the alert aggregation tool that it was 20 years ago in a lot of organizations, especially some of the SIMs that struggle with correlation. They have scale limitations around that, but correlation is one of the promises that in some ways rarely materialized, right? Rarely we can look at a world of our cloud and our endpoint, our network, and come up with some automated decisions around that. The other thing is just kind of this promise of having a full picture view of everything. Like, yes, but you need to have an analyst that knows what they're looking at. And in some
Right.
ways, it's just a faster way to not open the 5 different tools, right? So what did people end up happening? It's because they weren't able to solve it in SIM, they started solving it in SOAR, right? So they're like, well, I'm going to have my analysts do these 14 queries in my SIM, but they have to know this product and this source and their data structure, et cetera, et cetera. Well,
Mhm.
let's start moving that thing to SOAR. And then in some cases, SOAR even became a kind of a pseudo mini SIM, right? Another alert aggregator where they started plugging different things to SOAR because getting things to the SIM was too difficult, right?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of kind of broken promises in regards to data. There's a lot of kind of broken promises and hard to keep ones around normalizing, making sense of the data. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of organizations find themselves with a, hey, I have this SIM, but I realize no value out of it, right?
Right.
It helps every now and then when I have an incident, but I can't be in a position where every day I kind of go in and find new value out of my data. So ultimately, it kind of breaks down to that. I don't know if this is what you're seeing with
Yeah. I
comments.
see I see another piece of this too, where there was a movement around something that people called SIM 2.0, which actually was the user and entity behavior analytic. So it was like you have your SIM, that's where you're going to take all of your events, all of your logs, you're going to put everything into a data lake or a bucket. Then you're going to have this other thing that is going to try to make sense of it and then give you a timeline and let you track back to an insider, some kind of a threat vector, somebody's getting ready to resign, so they're pulling files down. They're like watching this whole thing unfold. And I feel like that was kind of the first two iterations, but I feel like where we're at now is we're on the cusp of kind of that sim 3.0, and that is where I would say Google is definitely heading, because now you're enriching all of these things. SOAR is becoming more of that user and entity behavior analytic because of the the way that it's designed, the playbooks, and how we're leveraging it, the automations and the orchestrations that we're rolling into it. So yeah, I think there was a promise back in the day of what SIM was going to be. We kind of missed it. 2.0 got a little bit closer, but we were missing some of that. Now let's tie in other tools, systems, and the things. And I think now we are pretty close to that initial promise, and it's pretty exciting seeing the direction that Google's going.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the UABA promise was that these alerts would be actionable, and they
Mm.
just ended up too voluminous and inactionable. It's like Brad printed a thing and he never does that
Right.
times a million, right? Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's a powerful proposition, but it's kind of interesting how you go from I want more alerts, I want more alerts to I want less alerts to now it's sort of changing to say, okay, well, UEBA is not just the mechanism in which you look and identify a new alert of something weird happening, but it's also the mechanism of which you measure risk across this, and it helps you prioritize your current alerts, right?
Right.
So that's how we try to guide our customers is, hey, you have all these low severity signals. Some things end up in the tar pit. That's just the reality, right?
Right.
We can tell ourselves that we automate and we enrich and the AI does it, but no matter who throws the alert in the tar pit, it ends up in the tar pit, right? Um,
Right.
what ends up with this new generation of kind of fusing that promise is now UEBA and SIEM stop becoming kind of these two different things, but now they converge with the UEBA being not just a high fidelity alert source, which it sometimes struggles with,
Right.
but also being a prioritization source and a helper for assetizations for understanding, okay, this is a user and this is normal for them, for kind of a decision assistant, if you will. So
Right.
really good point there.
Yeah, makes good sense. And I think that the part that I'm often looking for with any system is the data hygiene and the hygiene of logs and events so you don't get overwhelmed with signals that don't matter. So I think there's something, and we could probably have a show just on that. I was just thinking about that when you were talking through it, because that is where I spend the most time talking with clients, is just doing basic things like sizing. And before you know it, we're talking terabytes and terabytes and terabytes. And it's like, well, you realize if you would just filter out a bunch of that stuff and put it in the tar pit, because that stuff just doesn't matter, even from a signal perspective. It's not indicating much of anything. So if you were to just filter that and send the stuff that really matters to your SIM, then we can have a different discussion. We stop getting overwhelmed with noise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as much as we're team SecOps and SecOps can solve all the world's problems, etc., it it does come after hygiene and not just data hygiene. And that's one thing I think we're trying to put too much burden on the detection and response technology. And it really is such a complex infrastructure, especially with cloud and everything, where
Mhm.
those efforts just need to be combined with infrastructure as code efforts, with efforts around proper posture, proper change management, because the really kind of fun thing about SecOps is that there's pesky interns and admins and software engineers and people doing normal stuff every day that have to produce alerts. Well, how do we kind of model and say that this is normal into a meaningful structure is something that I think is part of the same conversation, because otherwise you're just putting too much burden on the SecOps side of things and
Yeah.
the blue teamers.
Yep. I agree. Another thing I was thinking about is something that I'm seeing is there's this movement towards cloud native, and I'm really starting to see this in SecOps tooling specifically, where and I'm also seeing this in networking as well, but that's a different show. So are you seeing the same thing? Is there like this rise of a cloud native movement in SecOps tooling?
There is, and it's coming in all levels. It's most fascinating to me in government, where basically CISA years ago started issuing guidance around, hey, don't be so scared of cloud native. It's superior technology for better security, right? Let's just come up with the controls to that. So I think as some of those compliance controls are catching on, customers just have more faith and confidence in the cloud native tooling. And that is combined with the fact that they're just sick and tired of managing all those failing over indexers on prem and basically spending most of their effort there, right? So It seems that in the last couple years, the wave has been very, very big. I think a big part of it is making cloud native affordable as well, right? So it ends up being more affordable with less to maintain, just punch in your query, and if anything falls over, it's Google's problem, right?
Right.
That makes it fairly easy. So I agree. The cloud native movement is finally something that can materialize on the promise economically and with scale, and can, you could throw a petabyte at it or 10, and it doesn't seem to have a problem with that.
I agree. I think it's getting back to the original promise of cloud, which was an elastic service in nature, something that can go very, very big when it needs to, and it can shrink back down when it needs to. And I think that is that plays very well into SecOps and the needs of that kind of a system or a platform. So I think that's one of the big reasons. So I'm always thinking of this as giving the audience a gift, or at least a thought.